Right, so I'm going to continue with this sort of fact versus fear and understanding that when you understand something, people are less likely to be scared by it, or less likely to go down the road of conspiracy theories. And I'm going to try really, really hard not to get myself in trouble by saying inflammatory things about conspiracy theories. I will do my best to keep it purely factual and professional. If I make an off-the-cuff comment about a conspiracy theory, I do apologize, but that is probably going to happen. So going back on this fact versus fear thing that we began with, in my opinion, the conspiracy theories are almost exclusively based on people's fear. And again, a bit of lack of understanding that we'll go into. And we'll use 5G as an example because it is a topical science topic at the moment. Again, if I stop or pause, it's because I'm trying to not get myself into trouble. Wouldn't be the first time an inflammatory comment has got me into trouble. So we'll discuss 5G and how fears of new technology, or technology in general, often leads to the development of conspiracy theories. So we have this effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it won the Nobel Prize in Psychology in the year 2000. And it basically says that the less people know about something, the more confident they are when they speak about things. Let's use our other science tutor, Elke, as an example, and her fellow first-year medical student. First-year medical student is fresh out of uni. They know everything. They're going to conquer the world. Everything is, and then they get to this point where they know more than nothing, but they're not quite confident. And that is what is called the valley of despair. So those people that know nothing are typically the most confident. People that know a little bit, or they also know how much, when you get to this point, you know how much you don't know. So how much you need to know to get to guru. So people then suddenly switch off and go, I don't know anything. And over time, you get this nice curve. So what happens is people that know nothing and people that know and that are what you would consider a guru speak the same. So they speak in the same way with the same level of confidence. The difference is one knows nothing and one knows everything. And it's really difficult to figure out who's who. They're both saying the same stuff with the same confidence at one end of the scale to the other. One saying something's bad, one saying something's really good. It's really difficult to know who to listen to. If we look at good and bad information sources, so what is a reliable information source? It's referenced, it's written by someone who's qualified in the field, someone who's experienced. So bad, the Sun or the Daily Mail or the Daily Fail as it's known. Facebook community groups, what some guy that you went to school with said he went on the internet and did his research, and now he is suddenly an expert after a week of reading news articles and watching YouTube videos. That's the first part of the Dunning-Kruger effect curve. So the person that knows the least, or the journalist that knows the least, is suddenly telling everybody what to do with regards to coronavirus or 5G. Someone else is coming in. Hi, Ali, just in time. So, a good information source is it's referenced, so it's backed up with science and facts. It's peer reviewed. The process of peer review can take up to a year. So I do an experiment, I write my paper, I say this, and then I send it to a journal, and that journal sends it back to me and says, change this. I send it back. That back and forth can take up to a year, and it's constantly being changed and updated based on the best science available and what you know, they're trying to see if what you've done is actually legit. Does it make sense? Is it reproducible? That is a good source. A YouTube video where someone's just stuck together clips and spoken over it, unless it's referenced, don't get me wrong, there's some really good YouTube videos. Unless there's something to back it up, it is just someone saying stuff. Yeah. So that's the difference between good and bad. You know, you can't, the sort of mainstay of people at that sort of first peak of the Dunning-Kruger effect curve, you know, they've done their research, and unless they've actually done research, it doesn't really mean anything. So there's nothing really to back up what they're saying. Whereas if you were to go to a doctor or a nurse or someone that has actually done their research, and you know, that would be a far better source of information than, again, Facebook community group where someone is just posting out of their head or what they've read or what someone else has said, and you've got no idea if what this person said is actually backed up by anything. I'm going to leave that before I definitely say get myself in trouble. So we looked at 5G. 5G is in the news at the moment because it's been, you know, heralded as everything from mind control to spreading coronavirus to setting birds on fire in mid-flight and all kinds of weird, wild, and wonderful ideas. But again, you guys are too young to remember, but we had 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and now we have 5G. So 2G, if you got those old Nokia mobile phones that used to play Snake on, like bricks, they were connected to the 2G network. So very low power, basically just transmitting basic radio waves to carry telecommunication signals. And with each number G, we've increased the power, we've increased the strength, we've increased the connectivity. What I just said, it's the successor to 4G. So we use shorter, more powerful radio waves, and we're able to use 3 different bands. I'm not gonna, part of this is not hugely to go into the technical aspects of 5G, but just to give you an idea. So we talk about Industrial Revolution in the 1700s when they made the first motor-powered coal powered engine or combustion engine, and now they're saying that this will be just as big for industry as that. So why does somebody believe a YouTube video over good science, peer-reviewed science, backed up science? And there's 5 or 6 main reasons. So a feeling of powerlessness. So let's take 5G. There's lots of conspiracies out there that this whole coronavirus pandemic is a cover-up so that they can put all these 5G towers up without anybody knowing. So people feel powerless over whether or not they have a choice if they want to be exposed to 5G. So if someone then comes to those people and says, well, this is a big cover-up, or they're just trying to get 5G in without anyone noticing, that person is more likely to confirm, or we'll talk about confirmation bias, to confirm their bias with that, as opposed to that coronavirus is an actual virus killing tens of thousands of people all over the world. So whilst it may seem silly when someone believes something that seems ridiculous on the internet, there are these underlying reasons. And it's amplified massively during times of uncertainty. So when, you know, the conspiracy theories surrounding 9/11, 2001 in New York, peaked massively after the event happened and died off slowly. But people were uncertain, they were scared, they were being told different things by different people, and they didn't know who to believe. So they clung on to this, well, if I believe that it was the government that did it and not a terrorist organization, then I'm able to cope with that threat because surely the government won't do it again. If we're looking at 5G, I don't really know what the threat is for 5G, so I'm not really able to apply it here. But people are scared that 5G is super powerful, it's really close together, it must be bad. So they look at ways that they can justify thinking that it's bad based on yeah, I don't really know how to put that into 5G, to be honest. Explaining unlikely events. Okay, so this is where confirmation bias and correlation and causation come into their own. So we have, I don't know if you're in Southeast Queensland at the moment, we have massive butterfly migration every year. When it's really damp and it's been really hot early on in the year, their numbers explode in comparison to normal. But what has happened is the coronavirus pandemic and the turning on of 5G in Southeast Queensland have happened at the same time. So instead of going, oh, okay, well, it's been really hot in the beginning of the year, then we had lots of rain, so they reproduced massively. Well, coronavirus happened, 5G happened at the same time, so there must be a link. And it's a really scary thought to think that things can happen that we can't explain. And there are so many things that happen in the world that we can't explain. If, let's say, I can see a mountain injury from where I'm sitting. If the top of that mountain, if I woke up tomorrow and the top of that mountain was gone and I couldn't explain it, that would be really scary. So people use these unlikely events that happen, and they use conspiracy to explain them because that is easier than not having an explanation for something. Not having an explanation for something is really scary. There is lots of conspiracies surrounding governments and New World Order and Agenda 21 and all kinds of out there theories, but there is a certain subset of the population that will believe conspiracy theories over anything else, regardless of what it is. And if something can be used to explain, I don't know, what's a government conspiracy? Well, use coronavirus. We don't know why coronavirus happened. We know that it's scary, but you can say the government is doing it on purpose because it's explaining an unlikely event, and you can say, well, it's the government's fault. And the government is an easy scapegoat that is often used in conspiracy. Lack of understanding. This is not always the case. Like I said, there are people that will believe a conspiracy theory over science, regardless of how educated or how well educated and how well understood they are on a topic. It gives a common visible enemy. So if you want to band people together, give them an enemy. Donald Trump and American politicians in general are very good at doing this. A common visible enemy. So coronavirus is scary, invisible enemy. If we blame China, then China is the enemy. We can control China more than we can control coronavirus. So that's why you'll see in the news it being called the Wuhan virus or the Chinese coronavirus, because it takes that scary invisible enemy and gives it a target that we can apply our frustrations and our anger towards, as opposed to putting that, towards the fighting the virus itself. So why 5G? There is this thing called the Internet of Things. Mind me. Can't work a camera that's back to front. So the IoT, or the Internet of Things. We have, let's drag this close to the whiteboard. We have the Internet of Things, so the Internet of Things is all the devices that we have, so fridges, phones, cars, tablets, radio, so on and so forth. So it represents the totality of things that are connected to the internet. Now, when this reaches a point, certain point, really struggling trying to work it back to front camera. I don't know why. We only have a finite amount of space within the 4G bands to use before we can't connect any more devices. And when we look at 4G, I don't know if any of you are gamers, but when we look at the ping or the latency, which is the time it takes for the connection to bounce back to the 4G tower, 4G is really slow. So things that require very low latency are things like self-driving cars. So in order to have self-driving cars, we need a really low latency or really shortwave radio frequency. Again, people going on about 5G being terrible and bad, yet they have 20 devices that are connected to the Internet of Things. And our obsession with everything being connected to the internet, from fridges to TVs to whatever, is what drove the need for 5G. Again, it's actually faster. So 4G at the moment is considerably slower than land-based connections in most cases, but 5G is considerably faster. It means it takes the pressure off our land-based connections as well, which require a physical infrastructure. If we can remove the need for physical infrastructure, then that's a good thing. So they use shorter waves and higher frequency radiation. Now, I'm using these terms intentionally as a scare tactic. Think of microwave, think of radiation, think of higher frequency radiation, and just think about the thoughts that puts into your head. If you didn't know anything about this, if you were just reading this on the internet and someone said, oh, they use really microwave radiation, it's like sticking your head in a microwave. Think like that. And that's the sort of thought process of the drive conspiracy theory. So more towers are required because they're closer together because of the shorter waves. Again, more towers, more infrastructure is kind of scary when you don't really know what it is. So the number of devices that we can connect is really only limited by the amount of towers that could be built. And I'll explain this in the next slide. I think I'll draw a diagram. So what was wrong with 4G? So you had your 4G tower here, and it just sprayed radiation in all directions. And what happens is they will end up far away from each other. So the further you are away from these towers, the less reception you get. So at 50 meters, you've got great reception because you're really close. But at 500 meters out here, the waves are moved so far away that there is virtually nothing. So obviously 500 meters is just an example. It does travel significantly further than that. But that's why if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you're far away from a 4G, your internet slows down, and the further away you get, eventually you lose connection. So these towers can be built far apart, but if you are smack bang in the middle of two of these towers, you don't get much. And this random direction of spraying radio waves is not particularly efficient. So we waste a lot of power, we waste a lot of these signals. Up to 300 gigahertz, so the bigger the radio waves are, the further apart they are, and the less targeted they are. Again, we're running out of capacity here. We can't physically connect more devices to 4G. In a few years, we will be at capacity. So they're rolling out 5G now in anticipation of this. It will also allow us to use 4G for things that it's better with instead of wasting its bandwidth. There are devices and processors that will actually run better on 4G than they will 5G, but we just don't have the capacity on 4G anymore. Next thing is 5G. Again, we talked about the latency or lag or ping. So anything that requires a quick response is not appropriate for. So potential download speeds of 20 gigabits per second, which for anyone that's had Telstra internet in a rural area is kind of unfathomable. But those kinds of speeds are usually reserved for universities, government building, connections costing huge amounts of money to build and maintain. So we can potentially connect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. Not saying we could, but there's potential for it. And again, we get self-driving cars and we can get even later. So why are people worried? So I remember, because I'm old enough, unfortunately, when they started talking about 4G, people said the same things. It's too powerful. It's going to do this. It's going to do that. Because we did not understand. And unfortunately, 5G is very much the same. I remember when they used to say, if you could only speak for 15 minutes with the phone up to your ear, otherwise you would get brain cancer. And we know that that's not true. But if we go back to those big scary words of microwave radiation, of shortwave radio, of it heats up cells and it does all kinds of things, people get worried because they think, who do I believe? I've got this guy over here on Facebook who's speaking in capital letters and saying, this is 100% true. I know the government's covering this up. And then you've got the scientists, little old me, who has to be careful with what he says, otherwise he gets in trouble, saying scientific ways of saying things are, there is no evidence to suggest, is a common way that science is portrayed, that we will never, ever, ever say something is 100% safe. That is not a thing. Nothing is ever 100% safe. But we have the evidence to suggest at this point, which is another careful scientific term, at this point, that it is safe. Because science is simply a body of knowledge that can be added to and subtracted from when things are disproved. When new things come along, you're just adding to this pool of knowledge. So as it stands right now, our pool of knowledge says there is no evidence to suggest at this point that this technology is unsafe. It's very careful, and you see doctors, scientists, all speaking in this similar vein, that as far as we know right now, it's safe. We do that because we know that science is changing and is ever changing, it's ever evolving, and things come along one day that flip everything we know on its head. But we can say with relative certainty that something is safe. Things aren't just pushed onto the market like 5G without being what we would consider adequately tested. So they test them on, unfortunately we still have to at the moment, we test them on animals, and then you do small trials in in areas that where people and the local councils agree to allow the trials to happen. And based on all of this experimentation, we can say that 5G is safe. That is really scary for people because they're scientists, they're doctors. Why can't they say it's safe? Why can't they say this is definitely safe, nothing bad will happen? And it's really scary for people to grasp that we can never really say that about absolutely anything. So these people are worried going, the scientists aren't saying it's safe 100%. They're using fancy science words to try and science me into silence. And then they go onto Facebook, and Ellen from Brisbane posts into a community group with a caps-laden rant and an accompanying YouTube video that breaks things down and makes them easy to understand and says this technology is unsafe. They've not even said it's safe themselves. And all of a sudden, this person that was worried before, who science hasn't appeased, Alan from Brisbane is now their go-to person for information because it confirms within them the bias that they already had, which was 5G is unsafe and we don't know if it's safe or not. Without really knowing scientifically how we determine whether things are safe or not. Again, unfortunately at the moment, because of COVID-19, people's fear and uncertainty and lack of trust in what's being reported is at an all-time high. Again, these new radio waves are more powerful than previous views, and they're shorter together, and the towers are closer together. And it's really complicated to try and understand. So if someone comes along with a YouTube video that easily explains why it's dangerous, it confirms the bias in that person's mind that it is a danger, then it's very difficult to pull someone back from there. Again, it doesn't matter what the conspiracy theory is, whether it's with vaccines, 5G, fluoride in water, it's all exactly the same. Same thought processes behind it. So we classify conspiracy theory as an illusion of truth to justify fears. People use confirmation bias. So there's that subset of the population that will never believe science and never believe medicine. And if someone else comes along and confirms that for them, whether or not that person knows what they're talking about is irrelevant. People will gravitate towards that person. We have correlation and causation. And probably the most important thing to remember is that correlation not equal causation. So if we go back to places where they did the 5G trials and they had mass bird deaths at roughly the same time when they were installing 5G, we can go, people suddenly went, well, birds died after they switched to 5G on. Clearly, the correlation is 5G on, birds dead. Dead with an A, not dead. 5G bad. Now that's a really easy assumption to make, especially if you already think that 5G is bad. The scientific mind and the scientific way of doing things goes, well, what happened last year at the same time? And they found that they had mass bird deaths at the same time. So there was a correlation between the two things, but the causation or the causal effect was not there. Or this was simply a coincidence that at the same time they switched on the 5G, the birds died because they know every year they get this mass bird death. Or again, another scary thing is they couldn't explain it. So people then go, well, if they can't explain it, that means they're not trying, so that means the 5G did it because. again, it's coming back to that confirmation bias. Again, every time we've gone up a G, the same things have been said. When you speak, okay, I'm going to use vaccines and try not to get myself in trouble. The common one with vaccines and the vaccine conspiracies play into people's fear because of what ifs. My friends, like my dad's sister died of SIDS from the weeks following a vaccination. Now, if we go back to correlation and causation, we know that just because she had the vaccine and then in the weeks following, she died of cot death, as they used to call it back then, that it would be really easy to go, well, she had a vaccine and then she died. So we're playing into fear and emotion, and this followed through to my mother, who is a nurse, who is very well educated and very, very good at what she does. She was worried when I had the same vaccine, despite the fact that it was a different vaccine. And then when I had my kids vaccinated, I had the exact same thought of what if it happens to my kid? And that what if is really what drives a lot of people into, I don't want to say the cult, anti-vaccination cult, so I'll get in trouble, but I'm going to anyway. Because of that what if, or, you know, I think it's a healthy level of fear and what ifs is a good thing to have, but I think you get people that take it to the extreme. And people, unfortunately, that will play on people's fears of what if in order to further their narrative. And again, no scientist, no doctor is going to say this is completely safe. There's no chance of it occurring again. You just have to think logically and look at numbers and scary, difficult to conceptualize things. Again, we talk about absolute language. Scientists do not speak in absolutes. Doctors do not speak in absolutes. Conspiracy theories are just written purely in absolutes. And there again, there's me being a scientist using absolutes. For the most part, conspiracy theories use absolutes. Again, we talk about this correlation versus causation. That there must be a causal link between two things in order to say that that caused the link, and often it's not there. So again, we're going to look at these direct 5G conspiracies. So last year, before the coronavirus pandemic, I think when it was just starting in China in December, a picture of a worker wearing a hazmat suit was climbing a 5G tower. Now, hazmat suits can be used for anything. They can be used to protect the person from cleaning products. There could have been something toxic been spilt on the tower. There could have been birds up there that they didn't want to infect with anything humans, but they wanted to bring them down. Could be anything. But someone looked at this and went, well, actually, why is he wearing a hazmat suit? 5G is bad. And then we have everything else is kind of spawned from there. When the company this person was working for came out and said the cleaner was using hazardous cleaning products at a height and could not risk falling or falling unconscious from the cleaning products, it was, the answers were, you're just trying to cover this up. So once we get past a certain point, it's very difficult to bring people back. I tried for many years to bring people back, and it does not work very often. So when we're talking ionizing and non-ionizing radiation is effectively nuclear radiation. You can get radiation poisoning from it. It builds up in the body, and it's very, very toxic. But most people don't know the difference between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, which is what we talk about with radio waves and microwaves. If you're sat in a room now, you are getting baked in electronic electromagnetic radiation from all the devices around you. It's coming out of your wires that are poorly insulated if they're old. It's coming out of all of your screens, everything, all around you. But we know that it's not a health hazard. But people just think, and they use the term radiation, and I hate when people use the term radiation because it doesn't mean anything. It's non-ionizing, it's ionizing. The sun is probably the most dangerous kind of radiation you can do, but everybody goes out and sunbathes when they shouldn't. But then we're worried about non-ionizing radiation. And you can see the disparity. If someone goes out and sunbathes, they're far more at risk of any kind of health effect from this microwave radiation. But they may be vehemently arguing it on Facebook or wherever. Again, this context is everything in science, and context is a difficult thing for people to understand. So if we stick our head in a microwave and close it and turn the microwave on, yeah, we're not going to have a very good time. Because we're talking about concentrated radio waves and microwaves. Don't do that. Don't try it. It's why microwaves can't turn on unless they're shut and they have shields. But if I turn that microwave on and walk 500 meters away, that microwave isn't going to do anything to me. And this is the difference. And the argument is that there's so many 5G towers and so much radiation, and it's so powerful that it's going to bake us, and people are getting burned from it. And yeah, I'm not going to say that because I'll get myself in trouble. But so 5G has been touted as the cause of COVID-19. And we'll have another one of these rogue doctors. Think of Andrew Wakefield that we talked about in the vaccine one, number 2 in the series. He's another suspended doctor. Shock horror. Stated that cells excreted waste products when exposed to 5G, and these waste products were causing the body to react as if it was a virus. The problem when doctors come out and say this, or they come out and say it in spite because they've been suspended or sanctioned, is people have dietized medical doctors. So we look up to medical doctors, they know everything. They would never step foot out of line. So if someone has come out and said this and they're a doctor, then clearly it must be true. And we know that that's not always the case. A doctor said this, so someone in a position of trust and power and knowledge has said something about some people are already scared of, and people are already biased against it because of what they've read on Facebook. They use confirmation bias to confirm their fears, and then they begin spreading the information because it then gives them control over this thing that they fear. And if we go back to why we have conspiracy theories, then we know that lack of control is the very first one. So if they can spread this new knowledge that they have control over this common enemy, despite the fact they may not have any knowledge on it, and they'll use absolute terms because of the Dunning-Kruger effect that we talked about. So everything kind of ties in together. And it doesn't matter what the conspiracy is, you can use the same method of thinking. And like I say, once people go down the pathway of conspiracy theories, it's almost impossible to bring them back. I spent probably 4 or 5 years, had a Facebook page with like 100,000 likes that we used to try and debunk conspiracy theories. And it didn't matter what you did or what you said, you couldn't change people's minds. You might get one person out of every 100 that you can actually change their mind. So when they sanctioned this doctor further and removed the video and came out with statements saying it wasn't true, it was just further proof of this global cover-up. Because now we have a common enemy, which is the government. Government's covering this up because corporations, because of money, for whatever reason. So everything is tied back to those reasons that we stated in the beginning. Again, confirmation bias and correlation and causation. So we have the massive butterfly migration that we talked about. Most of the areas that the butterflies are migrating through don't have 5G switched on. So to say that the mass numbers are caused by this mass switch on of 5G that hasn't really occurred yet it doesn't make sense, but it confirms people's bias. And you'll find that when people have a bias, you can have, so see person one has a bias that 5G bad. We have person number two presents a logical, well thought, and referenced response that disagrees with this bias that 5G is bad. But this person over here, this is Tony, who I went to school with. He has a mate that works in the government, and he says this is all a big cover-up and everyone's just being, So the person, instead of going, well, this medical doctor, this scientist, this WHO has said this thing, but the guy that agrees with me has said this thing. So I'm not only going to listen to this guy, I'm not even going to read this because that's just from some big corporate shill who's been paid by the government. Every scientist and doctor in the world that disagrees with conspiracies is being paid by the government or paid by corporations to spread misinformation. So, again, we'll go back to what we said, large number of bird deaths where 5G trials have occurred. And despite logical explanations to the contrary, this still persists. This is saying, this way of thinking, I find it really difficult. So if I'm sort of struggling for words, it's because I'm trying to change the way that I think to get into this kind of mindset. So we know that ionizing radiation, so nuclear radiation, UV radiation, can damage the body, can damage cells, can cause cancer, can cause radiation burns, etc., etc. We know that when we put our food in the microwave, if we put it in there for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, eventually it will burn. So if we're using microwave radiation in the air, again, it's already there in 4G and 3G. 2G has been switched off, but 3G and 4G is still there. And if you remember, they put out massive unidirectional amounts of radiation. So 5G is a lot more targeted and a lot less fluff. So if you were being exposed to ionizing radiation, yes, you would be cooked from the inside out, to use it for lack of a better term. But we know if we have an understanding, again, we can always come back to understanding when it comes to this, we know that it's not the case. But if you don't understand the difference and you say, well, it might as well just put me in a microwave, which again, was an argument being used against 5G. This is where scientific context and understanding context and knowing what makes sense is really important. And unfortunately, it's not well understood at all in the world. There's even very bright people can still be suckered down this path. You see really bright people that you would never think would think like this, suddenly posting YouTube videos that the New World Order and Bill Gates wants to put like microchips in vaccines to control the world through 5G. And you might sit back and think, oh, that's just ridiculous. Why would anybody think like that? But if you understand why we have the formations of these, and I hope that's you can come away with an understanding, and when someone does tell you something that is very conspiracy, then you can come back and actually, instead of what I used to do and just call them morons and berate them until they change their mind, come up with a bit more of a tactful way of attempting to change people's views on it. As conspiracies can be quite dangerous, especially ones about vaccines. So we have this, what we call fringe science, which those in the love their conspiracy theories will talk about this as science that is being suppressed and science that is being slated in the media because it doesn't agree with the big corporations. A good example of this is genetically modified foods. And despite that, overwhelming evidence that it is safe, you get 1 or 2 studies that come out that have been designed incorrectly and designed to make instead of designed to answer a question, which is what normal science is, they will design the experiment around their answer. So they'll get to they'll make their experiments give them the answer that they want, and that's what we call fringe science. And it's not the way that science is done. So Andrew Wakefield again. Not all scientific publications are the same, and you know what? Actually, I blame science and the way we set things up for a lot of this, because they say peer-reviewed journals are the be-all and end-all. So people go, well, if it's published in a journal, then clearly it's good science. There's lots of journals that you can pay money to have your work published. In science and in studying science, you learn how to pick what journals are good and what are not. But if someone types in journal article 5G, the first one is one of these fringe science articles that's been paid to be published, there's no peer review, then that person will further have bias confirmed by what they think is a legitimate source. And now I put the blame squarely on science for that. Unfortunately, it's not something we can change. But again, if we're looking at papers widely published, widely discredited that said bacteria can use electromagnetic waves to communicate. Well, being scientific, we don't ever say they can never do that. It's impossible. That's stupid. But they almost certainly cannot do that, based on what we know right now. So at least I'm being consistent in my answers, I guess. But yeah. So if we think back to the vaccine conspiracies that started in the late 90s, people that didn't want to get their kids vaccine and didn't want to get didn't want these max-based vaccination campaigns, but they felt powerless. So they came up with these conspiracies to convince other people. Coping with a threat, well, they thought the threat was Bill Gates, World Health Organization, wanting to control the population through vaccines. I don't really know how that is a logical thought, but that's what they thought, because that's what they thought the threat was, and that these vaccines were to control the population, yada, yada, yada. So when we look at, let's look at the MMR vaccine and what Andrew Wakefield said, that we know from the 90s to now, the rates of vaccines have gone up, and also the rates of autism and sort of placing people on the autism spectrum have gone up at comparable rates. So correlation equals causation. Well, the MMR vaccine causes autism, despite there being no causal link between the two. If someone thinks vaccines are bad, a doctor has all of a sudden said, this does this, it confirms their bias, they don't know anything about it, they suddenly are an expert on our Dunning-Kruger curve, and this is how we get the birth of a conspiracy. Again, people will want to go against the grain, so these mass vaccination campaigns are being touted by the government. The government is bad and evil, so there must be something else behind this, and all of a sudden we have a relatively mainstream anti-vaccination movement. Lack of understanding. Again, if we understand the scientific process, if we understand correlation and causation, we understand the causal link needs to be there, then we shouldn't go down this path, but sometimes it does happen. Okay, so let's go to the wacky end of the 5G conspiracies, and it's the last one. But COVID-19 uses 5G to communicate and spread. So someone has gone, bacteria can use radio waves to communicate, which we know they more than likely cannot. The science has been rejected from that article. So they've then applied that to viruses, and we know that bacteria and viruses are different from COVID-19. And this is where I have to be careful not to say something stupid. Once you go down that path of thinking, you can just keep going, and people will believe it because of everything we've talked about. It doesn't matter what the conspiracy is. Once someone goes down that path, they will keep believing, and they've done tests where they've done this, and they've just made the most outrageous claims, used the process we've gone through to get people to believe them, and people will believe anything. And like I said, there's plenty of places that don't even have 4G infrastructure that are massively endemic with COVID-19. So we know logically that's not true. This is probably the hardest thing, is to try and convert someone, because they started off with a bias, and at each step of going down this pathway, it's been confirmed. And a lot of the time, because of a lack of understanding, they're not going to know the difference between scientific evidence and bad evidence, or not a legitimate source. So you suddenly start sending these people links to things they don't understand. This is where people get it wrong. They send them all these links, call them idiots, say you're wrong, why do you think like that? You know, we all think that same way when we see it. But it's educating people, and educating them at a level that they can understand. And a lot of people didn't study science, have not studied the scientific method, and it's really difficult for them to think outside, especially if you think about the base level of fear is like down here. But because of COVID-19, people lost their jobs, people stuck at home, we have anxiety, we have depression, we have, you know, mental health problems that are being exacerbated. People will look for something to help ease that pain, and often conspiracy theories are a simple way to get a short-term relief from their anxiety, because all of a sudden everything makes sense. Okay, that is the end of that. Sorry, I'm turning off the recording.